Everybody, this is my KWL. We're going to talk through together. So, my communication domain that I chose is ADHD. As someone who has ADHD, I was very interested in learning more about myself. So, let's get into it. So, what I know about ADHD, we got a lot here. We got 10, I answered 10 of the 10. Um, we got a lot in the what I learned. So, I'm going to give you a little break in between, but it's a surprise for what that is. So, starting with number one, ADHD is hereditary, can pass down from parents, from genes. People diagnosed with ADHD have a higher chance of experiencing anxiety disorders and depression. My psychiatrist called it the devil's trio. Fun fact. ADHD has crossover symptoms with autism, which we learned about in autism class. Similar to autism, expressions and symptoms of ADHD exist on a spectrum. Um, ADHD can be hyperactive and attentive in a mixture of both. So, like fidgety, moving around a lot versus just you wouldn't necessarily know they have ADHD. It's more in their head. People with ADHD have dopamine deficiencies, which is a lot of the medication targets that. Seven, ADHD can have symptoms like time blindness, disorganization, disorganized thoughts, fidgeting, hyperactivity, inability to concentrate or initiate tasks. Eight, ADHD is hypothesized to be a disorder of the prefrontal cortex, which affects executive functioning. I would say nowadays it's probably less hypothesized and more just like known, since there's more like brain imaging available. Nine, there's a lot of medications available to treat ADHD, and it can affect people differently. There are non-medicational, like medicinal methods to manage symptoms like mindfulness, meditation, exercise, and CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, so next step is what I want to know. So I actually started this like at the beginning of the semester. Something that I would like want to know might change or has changed over the course of this semester. But this is what I started with. So, how are schools equipped to support students that have an ADHD diagnosis? Do people with ADHD have a higher rate of dyslexia? What is the connection between ADHD and language disorders? Is there a crossover between ADHD and dysfluency, like stuttering, clustering, or other articulation errors? And what are the tools that children with ADHD could use in schools and at home? So what I ended up choosing was, um, do people with ADHD have a higher rate of dyslexia? And what is the connection between ADHD and language disorders? So really focused like practically on what I was seeing in my clinical placement at schools. Since I was seeing some assessments that I was curious if the student also had ADHD and like, how is it related? How is their literacy related to them having executive function disorder? And the like, so one thing I'm bummed about is that I didn't look into this one now at the end of the semester. I'm still really curious about looking into whether there's like some crossover into the like fluency and disfluency domain with ADHD. So let's jump into what I learned about ADHD and dyslexia. I answer it right away. ADHD and dyslexia have a bidirectional comorbidity rate of 25 to 40%. So that means that both sides, so people who have dyslexia have a higher chance of having ADHD. People with ADHD have a higher chance of having dyslexia. So they're pretty interlocked. Um, so one big research article, that's where the stat that I pulled from. They also studied actual brain scans. So they did brain scans to see if there's actual like gray matter overlap that contributed to that comorbidity. So they were looking to see if like regions of the brain were diminished in both, to like further emphasize that they like are connected. And there was no overlap found, really, no significant overlap, except for part of like the brain, like a piece of the basal ganglia. There was like this right, I don't even know how to say that, caudate. Um, they think it might be related to like how they both have some executive functioning or procedural learning difficulties. Um, so something interesting, something more to look into. I didn't know about the brain scanning aspect of this. Uh, Cognition is broadly relevant for literacy. So, poor working memory performance, which is a trademark symptom of ADHD, has been found to be associated with multiple measures of literacy, specifically reading comprehension, word reading, writing, and spelling. Um, so, yeah, there's like a lot of evidence saying that the symptoms of ADHD um, do affect reading ability. But to what end? There's not that much depth because it's hard to pull apart the brain and figure out exactly why something is happening at times. but the evidence is showing that like working memory plays a big part in literacy for or dyslexia for folks with ADHD. The next section was something that I found out in our textbook, which is really interesting, was that dysgraphia or handwriting impairment. I'm so sorry, my dog is barking. One second.
Oh, goodness, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
We'll see if I'm able to edit that out. Where was I? So dysgraphia, handwriting impairment, is also strongly associated with ADHD. So written words are a foundation, or yeah, foundational literacy skill that enhances letter recognition, reading, fluency, and cognitive development by activating brain regions involved in language. Um, this could be another area that further research could strengthen the connection between dyslexia and ADHD. Um, so as we like heard in our language class too, like the importance of handwritten letters really solidifies that like the language and the letter correspondence in our brains for literacy. So since there's such a high rate of dysgraphia in ADHD folks, that could also be contributing to their dyslexia. That wasn't a connection that they were making in this research article. That's just something that I'm thinking of, which I think is interesting. They could be related, they could not be, but it seems reasonable to assume. So last part of this dyslexia section was that girls with reading disability had more inattentive behaviors when they had ADHD, and boys with reading disability had more hyperactive behaviors. We basically know that from just ADHD research, but something to be mindful of. All right, brain break. See if I can find it. Okay, here's the first one. This is my dog. All right, there's the first brain break. All right, so the next question of what I learned was what is the connection between ADHD and language disorders? So there's a high comorbidity between ADHD and DLD, so developmental language disorder. About one third of clinically referred children with DLD fit an ADHD profile. That's from our actual textbook, the Kranitz. And then children with ADHD have poor performance on measures of overall expressive, receptive, pragmatic language compared with controls. So both of those right away, like, yes, there is a connection between the two. Um, but like the pieces of what connects and what doesn't can be fuzzy, but I at the end of this, I kind of have some more clinical application that'll clear it up. Language impairment in children with ADHD often exceeds 50%, which is crazy. So people with ADHD have 50% to have some sort of language impairment. The research article is a summary of a ton of other research. So it's one of like, I think it's phase three. Um, and it went up as high as 90% in some studies. So this 50% is more of a conservative measure to like the high end. There are some key differences between a language disorder or LI, language impairment in the research, and ADHD that can be leveraged for the purposes of differential diagnosis. So this is what I was talking about where there's some clinical application to it. So tense marking, morphosyntax, non-word repetition, and sentence recall are the best ways to differentiate language impairment and ADHD by means of assessment. So the research is saying that those pieces um, are the easiest way to determine if someone has a language impairment versus has ADHD, if that makes sense. I'm going to say it one more time just in case it doesn't. So if you have a language impairment, those would stand out. Someone with ADHD would not have those same deficits if they only have ADHD. Everyone's different, but that's kind of what the research suggests. And then when differentiating between DLD and ADHD, some research suggested that more children with ADHD had difficulties with pragmatics, and then children with DLD had difficulties with semantics and morphosyntax. So similar to what the statement above said, um, if a child is only exhibiting difficulties in pragmatics, it's probably just ADHD. But then if they have the like actual grammar pieces of syntax and morphosyntax, then it could be DLD. Um, so those are two things that you could look out for in future practice. I hope all that made sense. This is my research on the side here. Read a whole bunch of papers for all this. Good times. And then here's your final brain break. my dog as a puppy. Look at him go. All right. Bye, guys. See you in class.